Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX, the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Xperience. And on today's episode, I speak to Kojo Baffoe about this excellent new book that he's published, Listen to Your Footsteps. We talk about the book, the process of writing this book, and the different themes that are covered in this book. Kojo Baffoe is one of the most insightful and interesting authors with a book out at the moment, and it was a great honor to have him on SMWX. Like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and today, as mentioned, I'm delighted to bring you Kojo Baffoe, the author of this fantastic book, Listen to Your Footsteps. Kojo, thanks so much for joining us on SMWX. It's always good to have It's always good to have a Liverpool fan on the channel.
Well, there's still a couple of us around there, you know? There's still a couple of us out there in the world.
Indeed. And it's great to have you. You know, I feel a certain connection to your book because Nadia Gautam, who tragically passed away recently, after I tweeted about my book, which is coming up, said soon thereafter, Kojo's book is coming out, Sizwe's book is coming out, and Khadija Patel's book is coming out. And these were the three books she was excited about. So really sad, and I wonder if you have any words of tribute to pay to Nadia before we kick off.
I mean, look, that was painful. That was hard because she was so supportive of people. I mean, she was not my publisher. I've interacted with her and I interacted with her quite regularly. So you could see that kind of genuine celebration of people, and also understanding, the inadequacies one has as an author. I don't think I'm alone in that. The imposter syndrome, you go through the feelings of inadequacy that she kind of got. But at the same time, that she was just so vested in so many of our lives. We weren't part of her day to day, but she felt really vested in it. And so, I mean, I was in the 2 weeks since the book has been out, she constantly crosses my mind, just because we had conversations about it. Her and Dr. Cindy van Zyl. Cindy had always said, when you do a book, you must come onto my show. And I was just like, Cindy, you're the one person I'll do it for. So that's the. I mean, it's hard to put into words. That's the tragedy of kind of this thing called life, right?
It is, and speaking of which, your book is particularly timely because it touches on so many themes which are part of the human condition, but this theme of grief and loss runs through the work in so many different ways, and how temporary human relationships are. Take us through how that theme came through into your writing as you were making your way through this book.
I guess it's weird in that it's been so probably the first decisive moment in my life was, strange to say, born out of death. My mother died in a car accident when I was just over a year, and it was her, my grandmother, so her mother, and an uncle of mine, my father's cousin. So I mean, that's been, that shaped a lot of who I am. And then having my father passed away when I was already 45, and having him as such a strong influence over my life. And also just partially writing this book because he never finished his. in a way. So it did. So I think for the, he passed away end of 2016. So it's still very, very fresh. Although I found that I've been able to deal with my grief. So fortunately, that the grief or the loss of my father is not as overwhelming. I was able to very quickly recognize that he had lived a full and rich life. And he was at peace to a certain extent, whatever that means. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but, whatever that means for you, he was in some, he had achieved some element of peace in terms of this cycle that we go through, and so that's why I guess in its own way, it lives. In some instances, it's like an undertone with some aspects of it. And then I also lost my closest friend. And for example, that was harder. That was harder than my father. He was just turned 39 years old. I mean, he's younger than me, just turned 39 years old. When you're doing the responsible things and we're looking at, your will or who's going to look after your kids. Like I had an insurance person ask me this and I'd never thought about it. But it's like, what if, because you always assume, I'm like, if something happens to me, my wife will look after my kids, right? They're her kids as well and vice versa. And he was like, look, what if something happens to both of you? And this friend of mine, Gerard, was that person because it's not just about somebody to look after your children financially. It's somebody who's going to instill or reinforce the values that are important to you and the principles that are important to you and ensure that your children continue to get that. And so him literally passing, I mean, when they say it happened suddenly, like we split up at 3:00 and I'm getting a phone call at 8:00. So that, to be honest, was the harder journey, which is a journey I'm still going through. But yeah, I guess because death was so prominent in my life from such a young age, my whole teenage life, my mother was an explanation as to why I was a different complexion from the rest of my family. Because the rest of my family are all primarily West African dark, not just dark, but like West African dark, right? And then I go, this is my brother. And people go, no, he's not. Especially in South Africa. It's like, how is your brother? I'm like, different mothers. And it's like, oh, okay. So for a while, my mother was just that. My mother was an explanation. So yeah, it's been its own journey.
It's an interesting book in terms of form, but also in terms of the themes. And I constantly had this, you're looking at parenting from above and from below. So you're looking at, what it's like to be a parent, but then you're also constantly going back to what it was like to, be parented by your father. And there's this constant interplay of parenting and being a child, as it were, from various perspectives. Was that something that you thought about in advance, or did it just kind of flow out as you were writing it?
So look, as a starting point, I wanted to write about my father, and I wanted to write about kind of being parented, because how I was parented and those experiences are what made me the person I am today. And my father was that example. So I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about being a father, because, and I guess it's being that very weird place where sometimes I'm doing something or experiencing something, but I'm also watching it unfold. And I tend to reflect on certain things quite a bit. I mean, especially as a father and especially as a parent, because it's a constant. I'll do something or say something, and then recognize 5 minutes later that that was not the best idea. And then also just coming to terms with the fact that, but it's done, right? So, you try to, I'm going to try to be better in the next 5 minutes, but circumstances have changed in the next 5 minutes. So maybe that better, I think it is. So, I think about I think about all of this stuff quite a bit. So, those are two key aspects. And in a weird way, so the first book I wanted to write was on fatherhood when my son was
The first of five.
Yeah, the first of five. The first of the five was on fatherhood, and I actually started that process.
Yeah.
And I was in magazine then. I just got too busy, and I just did not have time to, both time and just kind of headspace to sit and write the thing. And so it was always important for me to be able to document that journey, especially as a man. Especially in this country, especially on this continent. I just felt that maybe I have something to offer that was born out of how I was raised, because I wasn't raised in South Africa. So there's certain things that, there's certain struggles that for me they're easier to make sense of mentally. So I wanted to be able to share that perspective. So I always knew I wanted to write about fatherhood. I always felt that my father's story needed to be told. So as a starting point, it was kind of those two things. And the fact that my father was my dominant parent. And my father and I were close for, all of, the times when we were both conscious, even the stages when I was a teenager, like I worked for my father, like we were always together, so I also wanted to be able to share some of the things that I've learned on the way, and I can't help but those be influenced by something my father said, something how he raised me, a perspective that he had shared that, or something that he had taught me. So I think it was always a given, even in the way I speak. And I used to have friends who always pointed it out. Even the way I speak, my father will come into the conversation. Like growing up, it's like I had friends in high school. They always complain. It's like all the time. It's like, but he was that influential and that instrumental in my life, which I'm grateful for. I'm grateful to have had somebody who helped mold me and helped me lay the foundation for what I can do.
Yeah, it's interesting reading it because I'm quite a lot, I won't give away your age, which is revealed in the book, but certainly a little behind you. I also was reading it from the perspective of there are various phases that I'm, inshallah, about to go into in my life, if it's starting a family or just, that phase that a lot of which you speak about. So, as you were talking about your father's footsteps and your son listening to yours, there are also going to be a generation of readers who are now reading yours and watching your footsteps and working their way through, because there's no manual for this stage in your life, like the 30 to 40 stage. Like the manual just disappears.
No, absolutely. I remember like in your 20s, and I was one of those. I knew what I was at 16. I knew I was going to university. I knew what I was going to study. Like I was working. I was by no means like an overachiever, but there was the discipline and there were boundaries, right? And then you kind of go through this whole thing where you've got to figure it out, right? So this is what I'm going to do. And at this stage, by this stage, I'll be there. And by that stage, I'll be there. And then I remember turning 28. I think it was, 28. And I find that, I can't speak for women, but I find like kind of as a man, it's like the 28, 29 years old, it's like the universe just throws everything up in the air. It's like just confirm one last time. It may land the way you may sit back and go at the end of that, no, like this is what I want to do and I'm going to follow that same path. I went from running my own IT company to working with a fashion designer to running, when I still had the IT company, I was doing poetry shows. And then I was like, actually, do you know what? I want to be a poet. This is what I'm going to do. And this is from somebody who was always going to be a millionaire. Like, I was like, okay, when the year 2000 hits, I'll be this age. And we used to sit in high school and talk about it. And I'm like, I had it all worked out, right? And then all of a sudden, at that age, year 2000 hits. And because life does what life does, I'm like, actually, I want to be comfortable. I want to be content. I want to do poetry, do some writing, and that sort of stuff. And that's where I was at 30. And I guess that's if we allow it, that's the beauty of the journey. But it's also, it's also hard. I got married at 30. I'd been relatively set in my ways. And I talk about in the book, we struggled to have a child. My wife had a miscarriage, and then we struggled to have a child. So when my son was born, we'd been married for 5 years. We had a rhythm, we had a life that we'd built. And then all of a sudden at 35, you throw this thing into the mix, and it's like, oh my God, we have to figure out how to handle this thing again. But that's the beauty of it. I'm glad that I've been able to reach the point where I can say I haven't got it figured out, but I've also learned that I don't have to have it figured out. It's just focusing on now, focusing on the moment, focusing on what's in front of me, and keeping it moving. And hopefully, as the cliche goes, a fool learns from their mistakes. A wise person learns from the mistakes of others. So hopefully, with this book, I can share some of my little stumbles, so that the next person doesn't have to go through it.
Well, the title essay and the title of the book and the book all have this sense of self-observation, things are happening around me, but I'm also watching them happening. And as I'm watching, I'm learning as I'm going. As I'm flying the plane, I'm building it. And there's just so much in this title. Titles often, people don't think about them or whatever, but this title has 17 layers. When you read the book, listen to your footsteps. Oh, listen to your footsteps. Oh, listen to your footsteps. Oh, listen to your footsteps. And could you take us through that, where the phrase comes from in the book, which I also think is just a brilliant aphorism, and how that became the umbrella under which all this work falls?
So there's a couple of dimensions to it. So the one is, I think it was Steve Jobs who said, in essence, you can only connect the dots backwards, right? So Listen to Your Footsteps initially was going to be a title of a collection of poetry. So I actually I think I still have the folder somewhere, sitting in the cloud and a printout somewhere. But it all stems from, so I used to run the 100 meters. I did 100 and 200, but I specialized in 100. For me, there were very few greater feelings than standing at the top of the track and just looking down that lane. There's just something about it. That's, for me, what I wanted to do. And my father's like, look, you can do that, but obviously education and that other dimension of who you are can't be left behind. But after high school, I went to Germany as an exchange student. And I kind of used the Rotary Club to reconnect with that side of my roots. And one of the first things I did when I got there was I registered at an athletics club. It was literally my first week. And I had this old German coach. And he always used to tell us to listen to our footsteps. Because there's a particular sound that your steps make depending on where you are in the race. So with 100 meters, when you're on the blocks and the gun goes, your body is at an angle. So you're pumping your legs to stop from falling flat on your face. So you're pushing backwards. And because you're pushing backwards, your steps are closer to each other. Right? So the quicker, quicker your steps are, the quicker the sound of your steps, the more your legs are going to propel you forward. But then as you start to come up into your stride, obviously the steps, start becoming further and further apart. And the whole idea with the 100 meters was you actually need to be accelerating from beginning to end. So because he kind of instilled that in us. But then after I'd left and I went to university and I had multiple ops and I had a problem with my leg. And I had drop foot. I mean, my foot used to hang like that. I needed a support. I used to walk with you've all seen people so I used to wear a support to ensure that my Achilles didn't get stuck. And so because of that training, I used to hear my footsteps. And I continue to, and I write about it. I get bad leg days. I trip over my toes. I get days when I'm walking and I can just the sound of my footstep irritates me because the left side is nice and smooth, the right side slaps down, And so I always liked that title. I always liked that idea, but it was actually in writing the book. So in writing the book that I started to realize that in essence, that's what it applies to everything. Like you're saying, there's just so many layers to it. It applies to everything. And to a certain extent, that's what I've actually been doing with my life. So to a certain extent, unconsciously, even though, that phrase was there. And what was interesting was that was my working title. When I sent the first when I was chatting to the publisher and I was like, look, this is the book I'm thinking of writing. Here's about 10,000 words that I've written. What do you think? Once we had agreed, they came back and they went, so that title, do you have another title? I was like, actually, I was thinking that's the title. They're like, no, it's perfect. Don't change it. So, I mean, it's, what's the word? Serendipity, I think. It's like when everything just kind of falls into place and it makes sense. And so, like I said, in writing the book, that's when I started to realize how, in my own way, I've applied that to everything that I do. How I raise my children. I'm constantly looking at, in this moment, what's going on, and what's the next step that I'm going to take, the idea that it's also about mindfulness came to me when I was writing it. So that was something that I'd never thought about, and I was writing it, and I'm like, I try to be a lot more present. I mean, I've lived in the past quite a bit in my life, so I try to be more present, and I'm just like, actually, when you're listening to your footsteps, you can't not be present. So even that is its own, its own thing, its own layer in there.
So it felt to me like the book was an allegory for your life because you're telling the story of how you're listening to your footsteps and, working your way through. But then the book, you also say, was kind of a listening to your footsteps moment because you wrote it and it kind of became what it was as you wrote, as opposed to, this thing that was there planned up front. And despite trying to write 5 books that way, the only book that actually materialized was the one where you listened to your footsteps when you were actually writing it as well. So that was an interesting parallel.
I didn't think about that because I mean, literally what I did was, so I was like, okay, let me try this essays thing and just kind of show the equivalent of columns, which, I've written columns extensively. So it's a little easier to do it, or blog post, it's a little easier to do that than now trying to write a book where you're going, okay, this is where I'm starting, this is where I'm ending. And so what it did is it liberated me from the stress of kind of beginning to end. And it was literally anytime something happened and it popped into my head, I'd go, oh, let me write about that. So I'd, put it in my phone or write it in my notebook, and then I'd sit and literally open a new document. And then just start with that. And eventually what I did was I put everything in one document, and then every time I got an idea, I'd literally just do a page break and add it to the bottom. So I was worried less about, that flow and that sequence, which took the pressure off me, particularly that first draft. It took the pressure off to literally just get stuff out. I'm one of those, when I used to do poetry, I used to read a lot of poetry and I used to listen to a lot of poetry. I know, I have poems I can tell you, okay, that's who I was listening to then. Like the influence comes in its own way, but like I actually need that and I thrive off it. So I was reading books on writing, and I was reading collections of essays. And that's kind of primarily what I was reading, which helped me in that process. But it was nice not to worry about flow and sequence and literally just kind of get the ideas down. And so in its own way, it's an extension of that. Like the idea pops into my head, I just add it to the end, I write what I can about it, and then I leave it. And there's some stuff that was actually deleted. Like when I got to my second draft, where there was a start of my idea or there was a short essay, but it felt like it didn't fit. Like I still like it, and I'm still debating about, okay, do I maybe grab some of those, flesh them out and just plonk them on my blog, or figure out what to do with them. But I've been putting out stuff, what did they say, for free for so long that automatically it's just like, let me just write it up, plonk it on my blog and move on,
Well, Kojo Baffoe, thanks so much for joining us on SMWX. Make sure that you pick up this brilliant book. Listen to Your Footsteps is an odyssey into Kojo's fascinating life. And there's also a podcast, so you can listen to the first episode of that podcast, which is kind of building off of this book where he speaks to people. So make sure you pick it up. And Kojo, thanks so much for joining us. It was a real honor.
Thank you very much for having me.